welcome everyone and good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for joining us today to discuss equality and inclusion in the European election. This event is co-organized by the European Partnership for Democracy, Election Watch EU, Democracy Reporting International, and the European Platform for Democratic Election. My name is Caroline Johnson and I'm with EPD. And we are organizing today's webinar to kick off our new SEEEDS project. SEEEDS stands for Supporting Engagement in European Elections and Democratic Societies. And this is exactly what we plan to do in the coming months through a number of different activities that my colleague Michael will introduce us to in a second. Just before I give the floor to him, I would like to make a few comments about your interactions, because we would, of course, like to hear your questions. We would like to hear your thoughts. But in the interest of time, we will not give the floor to you, but we will monitor the chat and pick up your questions to the speakers. That means you can either use the chat function or the Q&A function to ask a question. And when you do, please be as specific as possible so that we can make sure we do get your question right. And I will then ask your questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. This webinar is also live streamed on YouTube, so you can always go back and watch the recording. We will share the link in the chat with you so you know where to find it. And with that, I thank you once again for joining us today in such great numbers, and I hand over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. My name is Michael Liedauer. I represent Election Watch EU, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first SEEEDS webinar. As Caroline has already said, SEEEDS stands for Supporting Engagement in European Elections and Democratic Societies. And in this EU-funded project, the European Partnership for Democracy comes together with three of its members: Election Watch EU, Democracy Reporting International, and the European Platform for Democratic Elections, to bridge the gap between active European citizens and European policymakers. And this is our first activity today. In the SEEEDS project, we have 5 interlinked objectives. These are to expand and strengthen civil society engagement in electoral processes, to strengthen the network of electoral experts for an assessment of the European elections in 2024, to develop practical recommendations at European level, to contribute to the fight against disinformation, and to encourage specific citizen participation. The webinar series that we are starting today will extend over 4 sessions, one every month until April 2023, each taking place on the last Tuesday of the month at 4 p.m. This will be followed by a high-level meeting in Brussels in May to take stock of key issues 1 year ahead of the European elections next year. The project will further provide voter information and conduct outreach activities ahead of the 2024 elections. And you can find more information about objectives and activities on the SEEEDS website. For the seminar today, which is dedicated to the themes of equality and inclusion in the European elections, it is our great pleasure to welcome a group of 4 speakers, namely Dominic Ruiz de Vesa, a Spanish member of the European Parliament, Honorable Ursula Gacek from Poland, a former member of the European Parliament, Alejandro Moledo from the European Disability Forum, and Noemi Archidiacono from Agora Election Observation. I will introduce all these speakers in a bit more detail in a little while. For now, let me give you a few inputs on the themes of equality and inclusion in the European elections. In 2019, Election Watch EU has conducted the first citizen-based comprehensive election assessment mission of the European elections. And at that time, we focused on specific topics, and the findings and recommendations were later on presented to the European Parliament and the European Cooperation Network on Elections. From an election observer perspective, one of the most striking findings of this assessment was that the European elections are really de facto 27 different elections, resulting in one House of Representatives, the European Parliament. Disparities between these elections result from the different electoral traditions and legal frameworks among the EU member states. There are many differences between the respective electoral systems and voting procedures across the European Union, as you can see on this slide. Members of the European Parliament are elected using a proportional representation system with great variance as to how it is applied. For example, the national threshold varies from 1 to 5%, making it easier for parties and candidates from some countries to enter the European Parliament than for others. Another rather noticeable difference between these elections to the European Parliament is the minimum age for voters and candidates. Back in 2019, where these data are from, there were 2 countries that had the minimum age of 25 for candidates in the elections, namely Italy and Spain, whereas the normal average minimum age for candidates in most member states was 18 or 21. You can imagine how this may result in difficulties, in particular for mobile European citizens. At the same time, the minimum voting age was as low as 16 in only 2 member states, namely Austria and Malta at that time. Now we may see a new trend for voting at the age of 16, as Germany and Belgium are now joining the club of countries that revert the voting age, in particular for the European elections, to 16. In 2019, we can see certain trends of increased campaigns, in particular for young voters in some member states, resulting in enhanced turnout, but not everywhere. We could see similar trends for the levels of women representation, while in some member states, this was representative of the electorate. In others, it was not at all, where we only had 1 or very few women being elected. We may hear more about this today. Also, the very access to the ballot through voting techniques differs greatly across the member states. In 2019, 10 member states had advanced voting, 15 member states offered postal voting, 6 member states had no out-of-country voting, 4 allowed proxy voting. Internet voting was only available in Estonia, and in 4 member states, voting was still compulsory. All of this illustrating the great inequality of the access to the vote, and resulting in a recommendation of us at the time for some greater harmonization. Lastly, in our line of work, it was striking that there are also different conditions for election observation across all of the EU member states, with some states having rather restrictive requirements, in particular for citizen election observers. Back in 2019, only 8 member states had both a legislative framework and an accreditation system in place for election observation, international and nationally. Now, let's bring the reflections on the past to the close and see what may have changed since then and what may still change, what we maybe still see in terms of electoral reforms ahead of the next elections in 2024. And to that end, I would like to open the room and give the word to our first speaker today, which is Dominic Ruiz de Vesa. Dominic has been the rapporteur on the European Elections Act in the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. He has also been the rapporteur on the implementation of citizenship education actions. And additionally, he has been the chief observer of the EU election observation mission to Timor-Leste in 2022. So Dominic is uniquely placed to open the floor today and tell us what is going on around legislative developments for electoral reforms in the European Parliament and beyond. Dominic, the floor is yours for your input for the next 5 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michael. Can you hear me well? Yes. Thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation to the webinar. And of course, it's very nice because, as you pointed out in your presentation, we had this a very interesting opportunity to work together in Timor-Leste at the time of the presidential elections last year. And of course, this is in a way one of the electoral observation, one of the, I will say, key elements of democracy in a way. No, democracy, of course, has many dimensions. And we know that a liberal democracy is not only electoral democracy, certainly, but of course, you can also make the case that indeed electoral democracy, a good electoral democracy, a functioning electoral democracy is not a sufficient condition for democracy, but certainly a necessary condition. So everything that we can do to strengthen that dimension. And of course, this is not referred only to developing countries, but also to developed countries. And as you have shown in your presentation, because I was following just before connecting the video, we can still make so many improvements, even in the European Union. One question, of course, and this is why we are also working on that, it's a bit counterintuitive that the European Union, of course, undertakes these very useful electoral observation missions. I was very proud and honored to be the chief observer with Michael in the team and other very good people in Timor-Leste. But then when it comes to the EU, we don't have a similar system. We don't have a standard system. And this is really something that we have to work on. At the same time, as you pointed out, we have inequalities when it comes to national elections, and also by default when it comes to European elections. Differences in accessing systems of voting. Of course, if we really want to have the best possible electoral democracy, the most functioning elections, you want to have as much as possible all the toolbox at your disposal, not only physical voting, but also postal voting, advanced voting. But proxy voting, I don't like it, I have to admit. For me, this is in our tradition, maybe more reflecting the Spanish political culture, that vote is personal and secret and non-transferable. Proxy voting is not my preferred option, but okay, we can discuss about it. The general idea is that you maximize participation and you ensure plenitude, if I can use that word, of rights. Of course, this is also very much connected with the rights of people with disabilities. Postal voting is a very important tool in that regard, but also full accessibility to the polling station. That means also, of course, for wheelchairs, for instance, but not only probably. Then we have the question of mental disability or restrictions, which we consider also undue, using like limitations on legal capacity to act, right, on the basis of some degree of cognitive disability in order to restrict the right to vote. This is, I think, a very big topic that in Spain, the national framework was changed, I think, in a positive way. But again, this is big diversity in the European Union, a big diversity also in terms of the right to vote when you are not in the country. So some countries have good provisions, so you're living abroad, but you can vote in Spanish elections, let's say, but also in European elections. But then, of course, if you don't have the right to vote from abroad in a national election, you will not be able to vote in the European election, right? Which is certainly not fair. And this is why, and with this I finish, just to stick to the time. This is why in our proposal for a new European electoral law that was approved by the plenary of the European Parliament in May, and with a good majority, and we are now in very difficult discussions with Council. We have a number of proposals in this direction, apart from a very important idea, which is to have, but this is regards more the specific system, the specificities of the European political system. This is probably not as relevant in a comparative perspective, which is the need to have a joint constituency of 28 members using the spare seats that we gained with Brexit. Because, of course, in the European parliamentary democracy, the system of identifying a prime ministerial candidate doesn't work, in the same way that it works in the national level. Also, the visibility of European political parties is, as you can understand, is much lower than the visibility of national political parties. As a matter of fact, it's an interesting contradiction. If you look at the ballots for European elections, you are going to find, by and large, the logos of the national political parties, not the logos of the European political parties, which is an interesting paradox, no? If you think about it. And then, since all the seats are allocated in a purely national basis, there is no incentive to run a European campaign. Everyone campaigns in its own turf, and it's much difficult to generate, you understand, a pan-European debate. So this is why, with a joint constituency of 28, you will have at least a set of candidates that need to collect votes across the Union, with the possibility of having the number one of this list to be clearly identified in the ballot as a candidate for President of the Commission. And then, of course, by design, the ballots will carry the logos of the national, of the European political parties, therefore giving an added value in terms of visibility. But the rest of the file, and with this I conclude, tackles precisely the items that Michael showed in his presentation. So we propose that postal voting should be available in all member states for the reasons I mentioned already. Also, for the people living abroad, and by abroad I mean either you are living in another member state or in a third country. So everyone can equally participate in European elections. So you are not penalized because your national legislation doesn't provide for that in national elections. So what we're saying to the Council is, okay, it is bad if you don't want to give this possibility to your citizens when they vote for your elections, but do not deprive them of those mechanisms when they vote for the European election. We want them, you understand? We want them to be in an equal footing. We are also proposing, which probably, but you, Michael, can comment on that, you know better, is probably a good practice to vote in one day, not in 4 or 5 days, which is what happens now in the European elections. And this is why we proposed, also for symbolic reasons, the 9th of May and single voting day, and to reduce to 16 the voting age for the European elections. This has had already some impact. The Germans are changing, maybe you know, their own electoral law to lower the voting age, and this comes on the way or on the wake of what we have done in the European Parliament. Certainly, still a long way to go, because for some countries, the changes that we are proposing even include constitutional reform, so we have to be aware of that. For instance, this is why what Michael, the Austrian standing Vertretung claims that even for the joint constituency, you will need to change your constitution, but you will know better about that. Okay, it's really not easy, but I think with this proposal, we are opening a very interesting avenue for future changes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Dominic, for your opening statement. I'm sure there will be several questions on the ongoing perspectives for changes to the European Elections Act and possible avenues for that in the remaining time frame until the 2024 elections. And we will come back to you in the Q&A. But for now, in respect of our time, let me turn to our second speaker, Honorable Ursula Gacek from Poland, who has represented Poland not only to the Council of Europe, but has been elected to the Polish Senate, was sitting as a representative in the European Parliament, and has, last but not least, led OSCE ODIHR election observation missions, most recently to the US in 2020, but also last year to France and Kazakhstan. So, Ursula, you know elections from so many different angles. It is really great to have you here today, and we kindly ask you to share your perspectives and experiences what regards the participation of women in European elections and obstacles in that regard. Thanks for your contribution, Ursula.
Thank you very much, Michael. When we were discussing how to tackle such a vast topic, you asked me to reflect a little bit on what has changed for women's participation in European politics since I left the European Parliament, which seems like a very long time ago now, back in 2009. And so I looked at some old and new problems and some old and new solutions to those problems. But I'm looking from the point of view of the very important second group in elections. We've talked about voters and voting systems and greater access to the voter, but of course an election also requires candidates. So I'm going to be focusing more today on how women as candidates fare in the European Parliament, in the European dimension in general, because when it comes to women as voters, we actually do not see much divergence in terms of participation. The same problems are faced by men and women. And if women come from national minorities or are persons with disabilities, they face pretty much the same challenges that men do with those same problems. So as candidates, well, when I looked at back into the early 2000s, there was a almost blind faith that if we introduced robust legal frameworks with quotas, with laws providing parity for women candidates, that was going to be quite a quick fix and it would probably solve the problem. But in fact, hey presto, it didn't solve the problem. That's not to say that gender quotas and various measures have not brought about very favorable results. But we will notice that there is no member state of the European Union, either at national level at least, where there are more female members of national parliaments than there are male members. So they're skimming close in some countries like Sweden or France, or maybe Portugal, but they're still not there. It does work. It's an old tool. It's an old problem, and I wouldn't want to overlook it. There was an interesting survey conducted by the European Institute for Gender Equality. They looked at 11 member states who had actually introduced legal measures, and this was from a period of back in France, the first to introduce in 2000, up to Italy in 2017. There actually have been developments since then. I mean, most recently, I'm aware that Malta, ahead of its 2021 election, which was lagging really at the end of the league table, introduced some constitutional changes, making provisions for better participation of the less represented gender. But according to the European Institute for Gender Equality, those countries which did actually adopt these legal measures, the rate of women's participation in terms of politicians, they grew 3 times faster than in those countries where it was just left to the decision of the voters, or more importantly, of the political parties nominating the candidates and deciding on places on party lists where candidates were placed, whether they were single member first past the post constituencies, and whether there were women candidates in winnable seats, or whether there were women in winnable seats, even on open lists, because anybody who's ever run in an election will know that on an open list, although the voter has potentially the choice of choosing any candidate, they tend to choose the first, the second, or the last on the list. So those issues have been tackled, but then we're still finding that women are reluctant or to either run or not transferring the quota of candidates to actual results in terms of seats in Parliament. So what other factors are at play? And I think there has been now a bigger understanding that it's not just a quota. So I will just name a few because of time constraints. The positions of authority women hold in political party apparatus, because this is where the decisions are made. These are where the seats are allocated. These are where the places are allocated. This is where the funding might be distributed. So women's participation in political parties at senior level has a role to play. But of course, you don't legislate this, but political parties, more progressive political parties, will advertise the fact to their electorate that they also have women in senior positions in their political parties. Access to campaign funds. This is where women can be seriously disadvantaged. And Dominic just mentioned a very interesting proposal of this EU-wide list where you could run as a candidate at a transnational level. Well, already when I recall my time as a candidate in Poland's system with very large multi-member constituencies, where I was effectively running what would have been a presidential campaign in a smaller EU member state in terms of the physical area I had to cover, as well as the population I had to reach, I can imagine that these positions are going to be particularly difficult if women are not well resourced. And maybe a final point here would be the presence and visibility of women in the media during election campaigns, but also outside the election period, where they enhance their visibility as experts, but also act as role models. So, old problems, old methods, and some more subtle, softer, newer methods that need to be challenged. But what is the biggest change in terms of the challenge? And here I must say that the toxicity of the environment, especially fostered on online and social media, is something that strikes me most. And it strikes me as an observer now following elections, be it in the United States, be it in France, or be it in Armenia or Albania, of course, outside, but hopefully sometime also joining us in the European Union. I just refer you to a very interesting report published in early 2020 by the Council of Europe's Congress of Local and Regional Authorities on fighting sexism against women in politics at local and regional level. This followed on from a report a couple of years earlier on a similar topic conducted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the Interparliamentary Union, and it makes for depressing reading. Women politicians are routinely receiving threatening email. They are publicly humiliated, especially when it comes to their family, intimate relations, on their appearance. Especially appearance or derogatory sexual remarks will affect women, younger women. Older women, they might find their families being targeted. If they can't get you because you're tougher as an older politician, they might find a soft or somewhere under your armor. And one example actually is the Polish MEP, former Polish Prime Minister, from a very different political background to my own, whose son was targeted in a vicious campaign because of a choice he made in his life, in his personal life. And because of his mother's position, he was vilified and almost, I would say, assassinated, which must have been extremely painful for a mother to see. So women, what are they saying? They're saying, well, we're self-censoring. Many are exiting politics. If you asked me today, would I run again for a political office in the current climate? You know, I'm 60 years old in a few days' time, and I would not. And if somebody with my experience would be reluctant to run in an election because of the toxic environment, how am I going to encourage a 25, 30-year-old woman with a, you know, who is going to be less hardened to what this life is really like? So if I still have time, maybe a couple of recommendations of what we can do. Well, let's see what is being done well at national level. Let's look at the countries that have got it right at a national level. We see this enormous, you know, assortment of rules which apply to votes, but it also applies to so many other aspects: quotas, legislation. I had the honor of being the head of mission at the 2022 French parliamentary elections, which of course was interesting that we had a gender specialist, a gender expert on that mission, where you would think France has ticked all the boxes, you know, European advanced democracy, and we have a gender expert, which is not always the case. Because what we are seeing is that still there are challenges for French women, despite the fact they have a very robust legal framework. There are financial penalties for parties that do not fill quotas, and this has been very effective. And they have laws on the criminalization of cyberbullying of women and girls. So these are things that maybe we could replicate at the European level. I think we could feed good ideas from the member states into the European-wide rules, but also see whether there is anything that could be taken from the European-wide level and acts as a catalyst for improvement at the national parliaments. But maybe when we have the second round, Dominic would also answer a question that I obviously immediately have, is in all these proposed reforms that I see, I don't hear much about enhancing women's participation. So has the European Union decided that this is not an issue anymore? That would be now me winding up my first intervention with a question to another panelist, because I would very much like to know what is in the pipeline to improve the position of women at the European level. Thank you. I managed to more or less keep within my time limit, and I look forward to questions from our audience.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ursula, for sharing from your experience and inspiring us to think both about technical elements, but also financial questions and larger societal questions, really, that pertain to the participation of women in the European elections. We, of course, encourage very much all participants and all speakers at the panel to challenge each other and get in a discussion with each other here in response to the questions that will come from the audience during the Q&A. But for the time being, we like to remind all speakers for 5 minutes speaking time during the first round of interventions. And we are halfway through. Our next speaker is Alejandro Molero del Rio, the Deputy Director of the European Disability Forum. We from Election Watch EU had the great pleasure to collaborate with EDF for their 2021 annual human rights report with data on the electoral participation of persons with disabilities from all EU member states. The agenda has advanced since then, and we are looking forward to hear directly from Alejandro where are currently the remaining obstacles for the participation of persons with disabilities in elections in the European Union, and where do you see perspectives in that regard towards 2024? Alejandro, thanks for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and many thanks for inviting us to participate in this discussion. As you very well mentioned, EDF, the European Disability Forum, we bring together the European disability movement, so the different disability groups are represented by different organizations of us, and also members at national level that also bring their perspective at the country level. And we all been working for many years on the political participation of persons with disabilities. And even if the EU has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and all member states have ratified it as well. So now we can say that we have this universal and common legal framework for the rights of persons with disabilities. When it comes to the political participation, and more particularly the different election systems at national level and at European level, in many cases, these do not comply with the CRPD standards. We see that some progress have been made in many member states, also thanks to the review of the UN CRPD committee to the different state parties to the convention. Now, actually, the EU is going through its second review. So we've seen progress in countries such as Spain, as Dominic mentioned, Germany, Denmark, Lithuania, Slovakia, France as well. So in this exercise that we carry out with Election Watch EU, in this human rights report on political participation, which I will paste the link in the chat, we still find different legal and practical barriers for persons with disabilities to really participate on equal footing with others. First, I will just briefly mention the legal barriers, which mostly affect those with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, but not only, and those who are in certain member states deprived from either totally or partially from their legal capacity. As disability organizations, and according with the CRPD, we are against the legal incapacitation, but still in 7 member states, being under partial or total legal guardianship would automatically deprive you from the right to vote. This still happens in 7 member states. In other 7 member states, this decision of depriving from the right to vote depends on a case-by-case scenario. If we look at the right to stand as candidate for persons with disabilities, and again, this particularly affects those with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, unfortunately, the EU countries perform worse. There are only 8 countries in which a person under total or partial guardianship can actually run and stand for office. So this would be the main legal barriers as for the right to vote and the right to stand as candidate. But as you can imagine, millions of persons with disabilities do not engage in the elections because of other barriers. Let's call it more practical barriers. And in this sense, we kind of classify them in the human rights report in different sections, having comparative maps, because in these cases, as it was also brought up before, having such a big variety of voting systems in Europe make difficult to make common recommendation on how to tackle the different issues. But we could definitely group them in around the main objective, which is to ensure equal access. And to ensure equal access, we identified that 3 conditions must be met. First, accessibility must be maximized, depending obviously on the voting system at national level. And by accessibility, we don't mean specific solutions for persons with disabilities. We mean like how to maximize the legibility of the ballot paper, for example, how to make sure that the polling station is accessible, is barrier-free, not only for people using wheelchairs, but also for people with intellectual disabilities, people who are blind, and so forth. So these are kind of the characteristics that all voters will find when exercising the right to vote. It goes also to the different ways in which we cast the vote. So for example, in Estonia, they have internet voting. And as far as we know, the website complies with the accessibility standard and is an accessible way for persons with disabilities to vote. The voting devices that we use here in Belgium, for example, many of them are not accessible because they don't have the accessibility function that, for example, a person with a visual disability like myself could use to enlarge, zoom, or having a screen reader software that can read aloud the text. Unfortunately, in this regard, concerning the legal frameworks, there are only 18 countries in which they regulate accessibility, but very much focus only on the physical access, only on the polling station. Where it goes beyond, as we know, it's also about the information that voters receive. It's also about the information that and the manifesto that political parties spread among voters. And it's also about the media as well. In this sense, there is more legislation concerning media, and there are really good practices in some countries. Having accessibility, maximizing accessibility to the great extent possible is the first objective, but then the second task, I would say, is to ensure that when accessibility cannot reach, because accessibility is not black or white, all countries, most of EU countries, actually 23, they adopt specific measures for persons with disabilities. This is what we call reasonable accommodation. And these are the specific measures that can facilitate that a person with a disability can exercise their right to vote. Here we can basically distinguish between those alternative and advanced means of voting. Some of them were mentioned before. Postal voting, which can be useful for not only persons with disabilities, but definitely is convenient for many persons with disabilities. Postal voting, internet voting, early voting, the possibility of changing polling station to one that is most accessible to you, the mobile ballot boxes. So the mobile ballot box that goes to either your place or in key locations, and this is very important because there are many people with disabilities, unfortunately, who still live in residential institutions, and therefore the possibility of facilitating the vote to those, and particularly those who live in close residential institutions, such as psychiatry hospital, for example, is of utmost importance. And then another specific measures, which we see in many countries, is the provision of assistive tools. For example, tactile stencils, so a blind person or a visually impaired person can identify where they need to tick the ballot, or magnifier glasses, or special, voting equipment. All these measures are particularly targeting persons with disabilities. And the third and final point is which is actually explicitly mentioned in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is the free choice of assistance, which should not be imposed. It should be a decision by the person, or the possibility to choose the person of their choice, and not to be imposed the help by somebody who is a stranger, and therefore you will need to reveal your voting decision. And unfortunately, there are still 2 countries in Europe in which a person with a disability cannot freely choose the person to assist them in voting. And obviously, these 3 factors determine whether we ensure the secrecy of the vote or not. And we can dig into more details, but definitely from EDF, we've been advocating also for the proposal for a new electoral law that Domenic presented. And we are also working on the 2 directives presented by the Commission on mobile EU citizens, because one could wonder what will happen if a person with an intellectual disability moves from a country that recognizes the right to vote to another country that doesn't. Then that person, by moving to another member state, will be losing voting rights. So we need to address these issues as well. And we hope that in the ramp up to the 2024 elections, more countries will look at how to improve the voting system at national level. And one very important key finding that we highlight in our report with Election Watch EU was that in those countries in which the disability organization works hand in hand with the election authority to create those specific solutions, or to maximize accessibility of the polling station or the voting ballot paper, in those cases is where it works best. And those legal changes that were behind Spain, Germany, Denmark, Lithuania, and so forth, the disability movement was behind them. So this is the final message that I would like to make. We really need to encourage the reforms hand in hand with civil society organizations. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. It is great to see how the specific advocacy coming from your network meets the more general trends of legislative reforms, not only for the European elections, but also specifically for mobile European citizens and so forth. However, the disability inclusion agenda is not the last one that we want to address today. We also want to hear more, in particular, from a youth perspective. And this is why we have invited Noemi Archidiacono to share her views also with us today. Noemi is an Italian based in Brussels with experience with the institutions, but has most significantly led youth-led citizen election observation missions inside the European Union and in its neighborhood over a number of years. And this is why we would like to hear from her regarding the perspective of youth participation in particular. Noemi, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michael. So as you said just before, in 2019, we had this higher turnout compared to the 2014 European Parliament elections, actually compared to the past 20 years. And we need to remember that this increase in the turnout was led by the younger generation, especially people under 25 years. In fact, the turnout of this group of people was 28% in 2014 and 42% in 2019. So there is a big difference. And an equally strong turnout can be found in the other age group of people 25-39 years old. That it was 35% in 2014 and 47% in 2019. So also here we have a big difference. And this, of course, offers a promising starting point for further increasing the turnout for the next European Parliament elections. And I would say in general for all the elections in the member states. So it is very important now for all of us to focus on younger generations, because we need to understand why there was this higher turnout in 2019. So what we need to repeat, what can be done in a similar way, and what is said needs to be improved because it's still not enough. So we need to understand why young people voted more. And they voted more because they felt closer to the European Union, because they felt that their votes can actually change things. In addition, all the several campaigns, like the one of the European Parliament, this time I'm voting of the European Union, that involved many organizations, local, international, like ours as well, gave young people real possibilities to learn more about the European Union, feel part of this European identity process. So from our side, we need to deliver more messages to young people. We need to tell them that their votes count, that the more young people go to vote, the more policies within the EU will be focused on younger people. And we need to also give them real examples, and we need to kind of work on this distance between the European institutions, the elected officials, and the younger generations. There are several theories, and I would say now all beliefs that describe young people as apathetic, that they are not interested in politics and so on. But I can say that this is not true, because we see young people in all the youth movements, in online activism, in volunteering. Also in our organization, we have so many young volunteers. We had almost 700 young people that joined our election observation missions in Europe. And we could see them fighting for climate change, human rights, and democracy. So young people are there. They just feel this distance with the European institutions. So next to our messages to young people, we also need to analyze the challenges. So the technical challenges that make voting complicated. So in our election observation mission in 2019, where we observed 18 countries in the European Union, we could find that one of the main obstacles that we could assess was that if you study abroad or in another city, also within your own country, then voting can be challenging because there are no alternative methods, because sometimes the out-of-country voting is very challenging, or deadlines are very strict, or it's not possible just to vote abroad. Even if you go to study, do an internship, work in another city of your own country, sometimes there are technical challenges, because the only way for you to vote is to go back to your city where you are resident, not where you actually are living at the moment. So there are these challenges that the European Union and the member states, of course, should work on to involve more young people and to make voting easier. There have been also some discussions on lowering the voting age to 16. That could be an improvement, because you can reinforce the democratic habit. But I believe that the most important factor, either if you vote at 16, 17, or 18, is voter education. So all the schools should improve civic and voter education, but also electoral management bodies, also organizations, institutions. And here I would say that the youth-led election observation organization, as all the citizens organization, have a very important role, because for example, what we do is deploying young people in electoral election observation missions in Europe, and we publish their findings. So we give a direct voice to young people that they will not otherwise have. And there is a nice quote from the European Youth Forum that says that there are as many Martins in the European Parliament elected as people under 30 years of age. So there are 6 people elected as officials that have less than 30 years at the moment at the European Parliament. So there are also 6 people named Martin. So they made this fun comparison, but it's also show this reality that we still need more and more young people, both elected and also as voters. So the 2018 turnout was a great result, of course, so we all say that, but it's definitely not enough, and we need to work more on the inclusion of young people.
All right. Thank you very much, Noemi. I think also there will be questions, notably also on the role of election observation and what it can do to actually enhance participation, raise awareness, and include certain groups in the electoral process that otherwise may not be there or may be there less. This would have been my second round question to all speakers, how they see the relevance of election observation as well as citizen-led election observation specifically in the European elections. However, I will not ask that now, but would rather like to open the floor. It is high time to hear from participants and give them the opportunity to voice questions. And I would then ask our speakers later on to address the election observation question as well in your short responses afterwards. But let me hand over to Carolyn to manage the questions and answers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. And thank you very much also to all of our speakers and their inputs. I think it was extremely rich and useful to know. So coming to the questions that we've seen both in the preparation for the webinar, but also the questions that are posed now during the webinar, there have been a lot of questions posed on minorities and the inclusion of minorities in European elections, with people explaining that they have observed intimidation of minorities in national elections. And the question is, what can be done about this? What can be done about this very specific discrimination of minorities, but then also what can be done to enhance the overall participation of ethnic minorities in elections, in European elections, of course, and how can we overall increase the representation of also people of color among candidates. We all know that Brussels is not a very diverse representation of the people living in the EU. And maybe some of our speakers also have examples of transnational measures on the inclusion of minorities and people of color. So I leave it at that because that already is quite a bit. I would maybe hand off first to Dominic to give us his feedback here. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And also because unfortunately at 5 I have another event to cover in the library of the European Parliament. So it allows me to react, and then I am sorry that very sorry that I have to go. I cannot stay for the rest of the discussion, but there will be someone following from my office. So I like, yes, indeed, to react to one specific point that was mentioned by Ursula regarding the gender dimension. That is very important. It is true that I did not mention it because of I had to finish my 5 minutes, that maybe were 7. But our proposal indeed has strong provisions on gender. They were very hardly, they were negotiated with the other political groups or with the political groups, and it was not easy to get them in, particularly at the time with the European People's Party, because you know, for this political tradition, or rather not everyone in that political tradition is comfortable, for instance, with the idea of quotas for women or the idea of alternating genders in the list. So, but in the end, we were able to reach, I think, a very good compromise on this point. So what we are saying is, for the current system of national lists in each member state for the European Parliament, and eventually also for the joint constituency list, there has to be either a quota system, and that means no less than 40% for each gender represented in the list, or a SEEED list of alternating men or women and men. At the time when I tabled the draft report, my proposal was the alternation of gender only. The final compromise was to allow for either that or the quota system. So this is what is right now in our proposal.
Could I address the question that has popped up in the Q&A, which refers to what the Dutch Parliament has done to improve the environment for women in the kind of language and discourse that is taking place there, which is highly commendable. I haven't followed it in detail. I would only add one thing, that I made a brief reference to a report published by Council of Europe. There is one that was published, I think, in 2018, as I said, by the Parliamentary Assembly and the Interparliamentary Union. And they created a movement in the national parliaments to tackle some of the sexist language and some of the discrimination that women were actually facing in national parliaments. I don't know how this appears at the EU level. Maybe Caroline might have something that she can add here, because I know she also had some input she wanted here. But I would recommend also looking at that Council of Europe report and some of the actions that have come from it, but also to look at good examples, as I already mentioned. Let's feed the best practices that we have at national level into the European level, and let's use European-wide reforms to improve the system, not only in the European election and the European discourse, but also to act as a catalyst for reforms at national level. This makes the life of an observer much easier, because one of the most frustrating things I do as an observer for the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or ODIHR as it's known, is to make numerous recommendations, some of which are followed, but many of which are not. So anything that can give more of a push, and the European Union has, more power than organizations like Council of Europe or OSCE. So if we combine forces, I think we can be a force for good. Thank you.
Great. I think we can move on with more questions. We have still people wondering how we can enhance youth participation and young people's voter turnout. So Noemi, do you have any ideas to share with us on this?
Yes, I also see here why election observation is important. I can try to combine both of the questions, because on the one hand, why it is important to observe elections, because also in the European Union, we kind of take democracy for granted because we think our democracies are strong, they are advanced, so we don't need reports on what needs to be improved. But actually, especially now with all the threats against democratic values within the European Union, with countries that are struggling defending their democracy, a war at our door, we really need to take care of our democracies. And observing elections give further legitimacy to the democratic process, and also people start to feel that they can trust more, because there are these election observers spread around the country, and their recommendations are very useful, because either we write recommendation as agro election observations or focus on young people, they can improve the electoral processes. They can actually see what needs to be done. And for example, in 2019, when we interviewed young people and also different stakeholders, young people say to us that one of the most challenging things was to voting from abroad in another city, as I said before. While the stakeholders, older stakeholders, they were saying that they were thinking that the most challenging thing was the opening time of the polling stations. So there was very different answers, and when you observe the election, you can actually write your findings there. So it is very important. And what can we do to improve the turnout? As I said, there are these technical challenges, for example, voter registration, if it's active or passive in the country. Enhance voter education, I think, is very important. They also organize, mock elections, dynamic activities. And also the European Union could give more funds to these youth election observation organization, youth organizations in general that work on democracy, and also spread around more the word about all the projects, so Erasmus Plus, and so they already exist, but sometimes young people don't know about them. So this could create a stronger identity process. So young people will feel part of the European identity process, and they will likely to vote more.
Yeah, and maybe on this note, we can also continue speaking about what the non-institutional actors can do. We have some questions here asking what the role of civil society is in the process. How can they come in, and really how can we make sure that that really the EP elections can include as many different groups as possible, but also that the EU institutions support civil society in their role to support different groups in society. Alejandro, maybe I hand over to you for this one.
Thank you very much. May I comment also on the previous question concerning turnout? Very briefly, I don't have the answer for it. I wish we would, but maybe the answer is a combination of many things. But if there is something that we know from the disability movement, from our perspective as persons with disabilities, is when things, elements, environments, products, services, whatever thing you can come up with, you make it more accessible, more easier to understand, that benefits everyone, not only persons with disabilities. Obviously, for us, is crucial. But if you enhance the accessibility, the legibility, as I mentioned before, the understandability of the process, for sure, you are helping many voters, and many people may not feel really engaged with the elections because it's a complex process. Maybe it's not fit for the voters that they want to represent through it. So it's a matter also of reforming, having the full diversity of the citizens in mind. And by this full diversity, we include not only persons with disabilities, but also older people, young people, people from who are not native speakers, people who from other ethnicities and so forth. So there is no a single solution, but definitely some principles that we can apply. And indeed, one way of bringing all these diversities to collaborate more with civil society organizations. As I mentioned in my previous intervention, the examples that we bring in this human rights report, particularly we dedicated a chapter called Cases Bringing Change, like substantive change, because we didn't want to highlight a one-off project that was done in this specific village or something, and it was done only once, it worked well, everybody loved it, and that's it. We really wanted to highlight those structural changes and those structural improvements in the system at national level that really brought change. And we see that there, in many cases, our members or the member of our members collaborated with the government to create a new, tactile stencil for the blind people. Actually, is the blind organization, as is the case in Spain or Germany, the one that develops these assistive tools that ensure that a blind person can vote in secret, for example. In other cases, the disability organizations were involved in deciding what would be the best ad hoc solution for different disability groups to facilitate their voting. Malta now, for example, in their disability strategy includes measures to ensure that there are more candidates with disabilities running. So there is a different set of recommendations, but we can definitely apply this principle of bringing the full diversity in the reforms that we advocate for at national, but also at European level.
Thank you. I don't know if one of the other speakers wants to react to this. If not, I will maybe close my question round with asking all three of you to quickly have a look into your crystal ball. We all know, and we haven't addressed the elephant in the room today, that there is a big scandal happening right now in the European Parliament, a corruption scandal. How do you see this impacting the elections that seem quite far away, but really are not? How do you see this turn out, and what can we all do, civil society organizations, institutions, to really make sure that by the time we have elections in 2024, we have really progressed in a way that we can say this scandal is in the past, and we are now ready to have very open and inclusive election. Ursula, I start with you, and then Noemi and Alejandro.
Thank you. Thank you for raising this, actually. I was talking to one of my neighbors here. I live in the Polish countryside, far from any big city. And as a matter of interest, I asked her, do you vote in the European election? And she said, no. And I said, have you heard anything about the European Parliament recently? And although she's not somebody who takes much interest in the European election, well, guess what she'd heard about? So this is actually filtering down to the people who are not participating. I mean, I can say that luckily it's a little bit way down the line. It's still quite a time before the election, and voters are known to have notoriously short memories, so that might be a blessing. But on a serious note, I think the only thing that can really address this issue is the most concerted and response from the European Parliament itself. If it is not seen to be weeding out these kind of practices, it brings disrepute to the majority of parliamentarians, the vast majority, who are honest and dedicated to their job. And it's always very worrying for those who did or do this job honestly and with commitment, when they see the bad apples who actually then spread this rot or the perception of this rot throughout the whole barrel. So I think the only thing that can be done is for the response to be strong, and people who have been proven to have had any kind of problems with disclosure, I obviously, as an election observer, I have also seen rogue members of the European Parliament in office at present popping up in some less, I will say diplomatically, democratic states, using their European parliamentary ID cards to be, as they say, rent a voice for regimes far east from the EU borders. So those kind of practices, those people should just not be on the list. They should just not be running for office again.
Noemi.
Yes, thanks. I was looking for the microphone. Yes, it actually can add some challenges, because I was talking before about trust. So talk from the point of view of young people need to feel closer with the European Union. And this kind of news, they of course at some distance, which is the one we need to fight. So it can be complicated, but as Ursula said, there is still some time. So if we go to the right directions, then the turnout can be higher than the last one. And as I said before, we need to really include young people, not just with some messages sometimes, but with real projects. So the European Union is already investing a lot in young people. We see that in the recent years, but it's not enough because the results are not great yet. So it depends on the direction that the European Parliament, the European institutions will take this year. Thanks.
Alejandro, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Karin. Well, I would just add that we should look at critically to the transparency and accountability measures, not only of the Parliament, but also the other EU institutions, the Commission, and also the Council, how transparent they are, how accountable they are, and so forth. But I think your question was also what we can do, and I believe that from civil society organizations, we also have a responsibility of being transparent and accountable, and we can and we should implement all the measures to to really be transparent and prove that we are a legitimate organization representing our different constituencies. So there is a set of measures that we at EDF we have implemented for many years, and we will continue doing so, because this scandal also implies certain attitudes from kind of NGO side, which actually also damage the reputation of all the good work that civil society organizations do at European, national, or regional or local level. So we should also bear in mind our duties as well to be transparent.
All right. Thank you very much all for these closing remarks. We have already reached the end of a very quickly passed session, which was very interesting to listen at. Just to summarize in brief words, a few takeaways that kind of tie the interventions together. For me, it was really inspiring to see how the specific view at women participation, at disabled persons inclusion, at youth participation throws different lights at the electoral picture as a whole, as well as at ongoing legislative developments. Alejandro has described it beautifully when he spoke about the various elements of the electoral process, flagging how universal design for the accessibility of the electoral process benefits all, and how much we can learn from this specific advocacy agenda. So that was great, and I think it can be transferred as a lesson to the other areas. We thank all speakers for their contributions. To sum up what Dominic has said, we must note that the possible electoral reforms on the European Elections Act have been blocked in the European Council. That's a matter of fact, and this is not the first time we are seeing this dynamic. This is already the second or third European legislative period where we see a majority inside the European Parliament supporting electoral reforms being then blocked by the member states themselves. There will be another event where not only Dominic, but also previous rapporteurs, Andrew Duff, Danita Hübner, and Jo Leinen, will be speaking on this issue already tomorrow in Brussels at the Rue Froissart Press Club between 6 and 8 p.m. I have posted the registration link here in the chat. To answer one question that came at the very beginning of our session today, Holly's question whether the SEEEDS project would allow for citizen election observation of next year's European elections. This project as such does not yet allow a targeted citizen election observation, but it aims to prepare the grounds for it and will certainly continue to advocate for citizen election observation across the EU member states. On that note, in particular, in the beginning of next year, we will have more activities targeted in particular to women, to youth participation, but also to the participation of mobile European citizens, a topic that we have not looked at so much in the past. And thank you also for the suggestion in the chat to study further the participation of various minorities. This is a suggestion we will gladly be taking up. Please stay tuned on the SEEEDS project. Our next seminar will be taking place 1 month from now on 28 February with a focus on transparency and in particular on targeted political advertising, very much up to date with ongoing debates in Brussels and beyond. Thank you all for participating today, and please feel free to reach out and be in touch with our team. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
And so, if there is no other comment, we will close this session now, thanking again all the speakers and all the people in the background supporting the holding of this webinar. We are looking forward to see you again online soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm.